I'm Daniel Brooks, and welcome to Zev's Bible History Podcast. This is episode 2 of our tithing series. Last episode, we explored how the tithe originated as a command under the Old Covenant, a system that was never just about giving 10% of income, but about supporting the Levitical priesthood, maintaining temple worship, and obeying God's covenant with Israel. Today, we're diving deeper into how that system functioned and what happened when Israel stopped following it.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting. People often think tithing was just a simple 10% rule, but it was so much more than that. It was about covenant obedience. And when Israel neglected their tithes, the whole system began to break down.
Let's talk about that breakdown. What did it actually look like when the people stopped tithing?
Great question. One example is in the book of Nehemiah. In chapter 13, Nehemiah discovers that the Levites had abandoned their duties because they weren't receiving their support. They had to go back to their fields to survive, so the temple ministry essentially shut down.
So without the tithe, the Levites couldn't do their jobs?
Exactly. The tithe was their inheritance. They didn't have land like the other tribes. So when the people stopped bringing in the tithe, the Levites had no way to eat or live. That's why Nehemiah was so upset. He had to confront the officials and get the tithe system working again.
That lines up with what we see in Malachi too, right? The people were holding back their tithes, and God actually says, "You are robbing me."
Yes, Malachi chapter 3. That's probably the most quoted tithing passage in churches today, but people often don't understand the context. God is speaking to Israel under the Old Covenant. The storehouse he's referring to was literally the temple storehouse where the food and supplies were kept.
Right? And the idea was, if they brought in the full tithe, there would be food in God's house, meaning the temple.
Exactly. And God says, "Test me in this." He promises to bless their crops and their land if they obey. But again, this was a covenant promise to Israel. It was agricultural and temple-based.
And that's key, because when we rip that verse out of context and apply it to modern Christians, we're ignoring the covenant shift that happened after Jesus.
That's the heart of it. We're no longer under the Old Covenant. The temple is gone. The Levitical priesthood is gone. Jesus is our high priest now, and the entire system that supported tithing has ended.
Let's pause on that for a second, because it's really important for listeners to understand how central the temple was to the entire tithing system. Without the temple, there was no place to store the tithes. There were no Levites to serve there. Everything fell apart.
Exactly. The temple was the physical center of religious life. Tithes weren't just a way to, pay clergy like some people assume today. They were part of the national covenant with God. The tithes supported sacrifices, priests, festivals, and caring for the vulnerable, all within that temple-centered system.
It's fascinating how even in the Old Testament, when the people were faithful with their tithes, the community thrived. But when they neglected it, their spiritual and social structures began to collapse.
That's right. Take 2 Chronicles 31, for example. When King Hezekiah reintroduced proper worship, the people responded by giving so generously that the storehouses overflowed. It was a sign of revival. They weren't just obeying out of duty, they were moved by a return to God.
And that's another point. Even though the tithe was required under the law, when the people were right with God, giving became a joy. It wasn't burdensome. It was an expression of their relationship with Him.
Absolutely, but sadly that wasn't always the case. Many times in the prophets, God calls out Israel for going through the motions, bringing tithes and offerings while their hearts were far from Him. Amos and Isaiah both make strong statements about how God was not pleased with ritualistic giving that wasn't backed by justice and mercy.
So the tithe wasn't a shortcut to righteousness. Just giving 10% didn't make someone right with God.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem today. Some churches present tithing as a kind of transactional blessing system. Like if you give 10%, God will bless you financially. But that's a misunderstanding of the heart behind giving and a misapplication of Old Covenant promises.
So let's zoom out a bit. We've looked at how tithing worked under the law, how it was enforced, and what happened when it was neglected. But there's also the issue of how it changed after the exile, right?
Yes, after the Babylonian exile, the structure of Jewish society changed. When they returned to the land, the temple was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The prophet Haggai even describes how the people were rebuilding their own houses while neglecting God's house.
And yet, leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah tried to restore the covenant practices, including tithing.
They did, and there were brief periods of obedience and revival, but even then it wasn't consistent. By the time of Malachi, which is one of the last books of the Old Testament, God is again confronting the people for their disobedience, including their failure to tithe.
Which brings us full circle to Malachi chapter 3.
Yes, God calls them to bring the full tithe into the storehouse, and he challenges them, test me in this. He promises to pour out blessing if they obey. But again, we have to remember, this was a specific promise to a specific people under a specific covenant.
So, in our modern context, that promise doesn't directly apply.
Correct. It shows us something about God's character. He desires faithfulness and delights in blessing obedience, but it's not a law we're under today.
So, to wrap up this episode, here's the key takeaway. The tithe was a central part of the Old Covenant, deeply tied to the temple and the Levites. It functioned within a very specific religious and national system.
And when that system ended, when Jesus fulfilled the law and the temple was destroyed, the requirement to tithe ended too. What remains is the principle of generosity, which we'll explore in our next episode.
Thank you, Mark. That was incredibly helpful and thorough. For our listeners, we hope this gives you clarity and a deeper appreciation for how the Bible presents giving.
Absolutely, and we're just getting started. The New Testament vision for giving is even more powerful because it's rooted in love, not law.
Be sure to like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And don't miss our next episode as we look at how Jesus and the apostles talked about giving. We'll see you then.